And welcome to episode 20 of the David Bernard Podcast. I'm joined alongside Zach Fridella this week. Zach, thanks for being here. It's November 1st. Yes, hallelujah. We are at the end of the road, it looks like. It seems like it just flew by. I can't believe it's already November 1st. Maybe it's just because I'm old and things start flying by faster. I don't know.
You're not that old, David. But look, you gave me a week off of the podcast, which I'm well rested now. I'm all energized. But, it's interesting to note that when you have a hurricane, for some reason, it seems like the life after a hurricane, I know a lot of people that are living in tents probably don't agree with this, but in general, it seems that time flies. All of a sudden you jump in, you're right in the holidays, and look, we're already having cooler weather. It feels good outside. Those are all good things as we move forward to recovery after Ida.
That's for sure. We're going to talk about levees today, and as it relates to Hurricane Ida and also our hurricane protection system in Southeast Louisiana that was possibly put to a test. We'll see if that's the case during Ida. Our two guests, very well known in the community, certainly since Hurricane Katrina, for their commitment to levee protection. Sandy Rosenthal is the founder and president of Levees.org, and for those who don't know, Levees.org was on the front lines almost as soon as the flood walls and the levees failed in Katrina, and they were there to hold the government, and specifically the Corps of Engineers, accountable for what we now know is a catastrophic design flaw in the system. She just published her first book this last year. She said it took 5 years for her to write. Words Whispered in Water, Why the Levees Broke in Katrina, and I'm about halfway through it. It's quite good, I must say. And of course, we're going to ask her about that. And she has a podcast, a relatively new one, and I am sure her podcast is better than my podcast. We'll see. I'm going to ask her about that as well. Hey, I'm only on episode 20, but I think she's just started as well. Incredibly bright woman. Our second guest, an incredibly bright gentleman, H.J. Bosworth, a civil and structural engineer, has also become really the face of levee protection since Hurricane Katrina. He graduated from LSU. He has nearly 40 years of experience as an engineer. He's been director of research for Levees.org, and he also provides expert witness services as it relates to structural engineering failures, as well as hydrology studies, which is a big factor when you're talking about levee protection, because the hydrology studies are, in other words, how changes in the water might impact flooding. Because as you know, when you protect one person, the water just doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere, and so he provides critical advice on that. Well, it's been over 2 months since Ida. We just passed the 2-month anniversary. Seems like an eternity, as we were saying. But, when we talk about the Friends in the River and Bayou parishes that really took the brunt of this storm, some of them, they haven't even started putting their lives back together yet.
Yeah, and it's going to be a process. It's not going to happen in a week or two. And as they know, it's been 2 months. But slowly but surely, you have to gain that momentum where you keep moving forward and you keep building your life back. And that's what the hope and the optimism is for all of these coastal areas. In fact, Fox 8, the morning edition this week, we're going to go to each parish on the South Shore, at least, that was hardest hit. Today we took Jefferson Parish, where we went to Lafitte. We also went to Grand Isle, and we're just checking in to see what the recovery is like, because you don't want to forget about any of these areas. And as we go throughout this week, we'll go to Terrebonne, we'll go to Lafourche, and of course St. John and St. Charles parishes as we kind of tour the whole area that was hardest hit by Ida.
Yeah, on a positive note, we've got subtropical storm Wanda that formed out in the Atlantic in the last 24 hours or so. That's not going to be anything. It's out in the North Atlantic, but it had been since October 5th. That when Sam faded away in the Atlantic, that we had a tropical storm or hurricane. And according to Dr. Phil Klotzbach, that's the longest stretch during the active period, and the active period is considered to have started in 1995. Since 2006 and 2007, that we'd gone without a storm. So, we really saw this kind of incredible shutdown that happened. It's not that October necessarily is always busy, but certainly it seemed like from what the climate factors were out there, specifically La Nina, it might not have gone that way.
Yeah, active Octobers have a correlation to La Nina years. We're in a La Nina year just like we were last year, And it's like, okay, what happened last year? We saw all these storms in October, and even November we had Eta and Iota. Both of those storms were significant hurricanes into Central America into November. But this year we're in a La Nina. You should have an active October, but it's just not happening. The whole shutdown has commenced, and Wanda is a subtropical storm, but it's interesting to note it is the last name on the 2021 list. So we're not using Greek names. If we do happen to get some random November storm, which won't be in the Gulf, that'll be out and over the Atlantic someplace, we would move to the new supplemental list, no longer using those Greek names.
Do you remember what the first name is in the supplemental list? I don't.
Adria, it's Adria
I
or
think
something. I was
I think
talking
it's
about it this
Adrian.
morning. Yeah.
We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Well, the question today for our guests will center around Ida, among other things, but primarily Ida. Did the levees work? Were there areas of concern where the levees might have shown some weakness, or were they just not tested by Ida? If they were, where were they, and what still needs to be done to fortify our defenses? Let's now bring in our guests today, Sandy and HJ. Sandy and HJ, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, the first
Thank you.
thing I want
Good seeing you.
yeah, you too, AJ. The first thing I want to ask you guys, and I'll start with you, Sandy, is how did you fare during Ida?
The the way we fared during Ida, well, I actually did evacuate, but not because I was concerned about flooding. I absolutely had to have a perfect internet working the following Monday, the day after Ida. So I actually did go and stay with my daughter in California. However, my son Stanford, co-founder of Levees.org, he did stay in my home, and he like me was not concerned about flooding for several reasons. One is the storm was very different storm surge than Hurricane Katrina, and two, we now have a $16 billion flood protection system, and so he stayed here. And as you know, the city did pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. And HJ, how were things on your end?
We did fine. I rode the storm out here in my old house. Lost a slate shingle and a piece of terracotta, a hip cap. Other than that, it was all good. You know, for 6 days without power, it got a little warm.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, that's the one thing that really is the biggest inconvenience after storms, in a storm like Ida, at least as far as the New Orleans area goes, is how reliant we are on power, and that can be a big problem. Sandy, I wanted to talk about Levees.org. Obviously, if some people don't know about it, it's a little bit surprising, but of course we're going to be broadcasting this out to really a national audience, that whoever gets our podcast and is on our website, fox8live.com. But we did mention briefly in our introduction how Levees.org came about, just for that educational purpose, but we want everyone to hear your experiences directly, as well as HJ that might be unfamiliar. And we're going to get to that a little bit later on. But first, briefly, who and what does Levees.org advocate for specifically?
We advocate for the 62% of the American population that lives in counties protected by levees. That translates into over 100 million people who may not be aware that they're in danger of possibly flooding due to levee breaches or levee overtopping.
So that's pretty incredible. I mean, you've taken this mission that started 16 years ago with Hurricane Katrina, and now really made it an effort to educate the entire country. There's many, I know from being in Florida for some time, you talk about the Lake Okeechobee levees, there's many portions of the country that are at high risk due to decaying infrastructure.
Yes, that's true also in California, and also in Texas, Washington, D.C. Again, any large metropolitan area that has areas that are in a floodplain are definitely in possibility of being affected by levee failure or levee overtopping.
And when you first founded Levees.org, obviously the primary focus, at least here locally, was on what is now known as the Hurricane Risk Reduction System around the New Orleans area.
our focus was to address a wild fairy tale that took flight right after the levees broke. This fairy tale was monster storm hit a city below sea level, and they're all corrupt down there, so they must have brought this misfortune upon themselves. When the fact is, the levees were misdesigned and improperly built by the Army Corps of Engineers, and we felt that it was important that the entire country know about this again, because so many people, almost 2/3 of the nation's population, live by levees. And also, it is important to get the truth out there about why New Orleans flooded. This was not a minor disaster. This was a bona fide catastrophe. Over 1,500 people died right away, $170 billion worth of damage, adjusted for inflation. So this was no small event, and we felt that the truth was important to get out there.
Okay, Zach, do you want to bring AJ in?
Yeah, so HJ, I mean, like Sandy was just talking about, we went through Katrina, and we all know how that all played out as far as the levees go. Now we've fast forward to this year, and fast forward to what's going on over the past 2 years. We've had Ida most recently, and we've also had we're looking back to Zeta last year. Two really different storms, very strong storms. Ida, of course, a Category 4. How did the levees do? Were there any failures on any aspect? And was this that storm that we need to say, okay, that tested our levees, truly tested our levees since Katrina?
Okay. I'll call it a flood protection system just because it's easier to say, and that's what I think it should be anyway. The two storms we just had weren't big wave makers. They weren't big flood makers, unless you're in areas that did not have protection. When Ida hit, folks in Laplace got hit pretty hard because of all the wind and from the east pushing the Lake Pontchartrain into their front yards and into their houses. So every storm has a different personality. Every storm has a different flood risk. And what we found is that the people with different flood risks lived in places where they flooded. And our hurricane protection system that protects New Orleans, starting at the Great Wall out in St. Bernard and heading off to New Orleans East and that sort of beyond New Orleans East to Irish Bayou, is really the best that we could hope for at that time. Certainly it can be better. Certainly it should be stronger. Certainly it should give us more like 1,000-year protection. After all, we're the Port of New Orleans, and we need to make sure that the nation that depends on the Port of New Orleans to move goods in and out can count on our city and our people here to make sure the flood protection, to make sure that things continue business as usual when a big storm hits.
Sandy, let me ask you this. There was a lot of national media coverage after Ida. You were interviewed in several different newspapers and publications saying, hey, the flood protection worked in New Orleans. Congratulations. Everything that we planned for after Katrina worked. And certainly we want to project that image to the nation that New Orleans is a much safer place now as far as when it comes to hurricanes. But we have to be a little bit careful about the way we frame that.
I totally agree with you. Yes, I was interviewed by the Washington Post, the Business Journal. I've forgotten how many. And there was one thing that I really wanted everybody to remember. Yes, we have a better system. Yes, the system worked. Yes, we now have a much better protection. We can worry a lot less. However, that came at an unspeakable human cost. Over 1,500 people lost their lives 16 years ago because we didn't have the system that we had today. It took a catastrophe for our federal government, or for all of us, to find out that our federal government had made a big mistake 16 years ago. So that is what I wanted to remind everybody. You can't just forget that happened. You can't just go dancing in the streets that we have a flood protection system that works, when so many people I know lost a relative to the flooding, either in their attic or trying to find their cat. I'm sorry, this gets me upset, but we can't just forget that. This isn't This is no different from the Titanic, where about the same number of people died, and 100 years ago, people are still talking about it. And after the Titanic, laws were changed to make sure that there's enough lifeboats. And fortunately, after what happened to us, laws are changed so that the people of America who live by levees are now safer due to lots of federal changes in laws since then.
What about locally? Do you worry about citizens that might be a little bit complacent now? I've talked to some people that actually live up against some of these great flood walls that we have now lining the canals, and they say, "Oh, I'm fine now. I may not need to evacuate for a storm. I've got this here." So that's a whole other side of the education process that needs to take place.
You raise a good point. Should we be worried about our levees? They were built by the federal government. I know when I get in my car and drive across on the interstate and drive on a bridge, I don't worry that the bridge is going to fall down. It's built by the federal government. And I can understand why a lot of people believed in our levees when Hurricane Katrina arrived. And I can even understand a little complacency coming along. In the Netherlands, they don't worry at all about their flood protection working. They have 10,000-year protection in the Netherlands. But getting back to the difference between 100 and 10,000, we have only 100-year protection here in New Orleans. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. We should remain vigilant about our flood protection in New Orleans.
Zach?
And what's interesting to note about what you say, like every passing storm, you almost get more confidence as our flood protection system plays out, and then, okay, we didn't get water in the city and whatnot. And this is probably a good question for HJ here, because you handled the engineering aspect of this, and you've seen the storm modeling and whatnot. What do you think would have happened? Do you think that our flood protection would have been fine if Ida would have taken that more eastward shift, maybe right into a Barataria Bay, where that 12 to 14, 15-foot wall of water that went more so over Grand Island, Port Fourchon, would have forced its way into Barataria Bay, and more so maybe possibly even the eastern side of New Orleans if that track was a little bit more east?
The flood protection system over there, St. Bernard, along the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, all the way out to Irish Bayou, is very serious. It's very good. It's certainly hasn't been tested since it's been improved, and it was improved to a pretty hefty price tag after the flood of 2005. I think we would have done fine, but every storm shows the weakness in the system, and every storm provides an education as to, okay, this isn't good, or that isn't good, or we need to do more here or more there. And so it's an ever changing challenge, where the Corps of Engineers and the local levee authorities to do what they can do, which is limited. Urging the Corps to say to improve the system, make it more robust, and fill the gaps here or there, wherever they are.
Well, so let me ask you this, since we're bringing the Corps up, and let me ask you, Sandy, how, I don't want to say how is your relationship with the Corps today, but how do you feel the Corps is responding to flood and levee protection projects in future planning compared to the past? Do you see a cultural change there, any kind of shift? What's your assessment?
The Army Corps of Engineers is a huge organization, as you know, and you can ask about my relationship with the Army Corps. That's totally fine. It's definitely better than right after the levees broke 16 years ago. For several years, the Army Corps of Engineers kept me at a distance. They've changed that, especially after we caught the Army Corps of Engineers sitting at their computers harassing me and my group online. And after that, it was a whole shift in the way the Army Corps treats me and other people in the community as well. Since then, they've started up meetings with non-governmental organizations like my own to keep a better back and forth going on. Also, I will compliment the Army Corps that they have taken climate change into their design plans moving forward, which is, whether or not you believe global warming is happening or not, the Army Corps is taking it into account as they do their new designs. So the answer is yes. I see improvement. I see an improvement in my relationship with them and Levees.org, and I also think that they are doing a better job of administering the funding that's coming from Congress.
That's good. That's good to hear all of that, as a matter of fact, and I would agree with that assessment. I want to talk about your new book, or I guess it's pretty new. It came out a year ago in 2020. I told Sandy earlier. I said, I was a little embarrassed. I didn't even know you had this book out. She said, "Look, it came out in the middle of a pandemic, and I'm almost through it, and it's quite compelling." The title is "Words Whispered in Water: Why the Levees Broke in Hurricane Katrina," and talking about everything that happened with you personally with the storm, and then the whole process that led to what we've been talking about today. What was it like to write that book 15 years later?
It was interesting. It took me 5 years to write, and I spent a full 2 or 3 months just taking stock of all of the things that Levees.org had done over the past decade. And it was like, wow, look at this, look at that, look at how we did this. For example, we put up plaques at breach sites, and we had a bike tour, and we have a flooded house museum, and we pushed for federal reform. We did a lot of things. So I took stock of what we had. It took 5 years to write, and I wrote the book for one reason, and one reason only. It was one more way to get the truth out there about why New Orleans flooded and why it went underwater and what needs to be done to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. I'm not going to be around forever, but my book will be around forever.
Well, and so we have Sandy and HJ. We got you there, and why don't you talk a little bit about how you got involved with Levees.org? It was pretty much from the get-go.
Pretty much. When in 2006, right after Jazz Fest, Bob B. was in town, the amazing professor from UC Berkeley in California, who was very instrumental in exposing some foolishness that the Corps was attempting back in 2006. And I was invited to a get-together. Bob B. was there. Bob B. looked me straight in the face and he says, if you don't do something about this, no one will. Get with Sandy Rosenthal, help her out, make things change. And so that was it. I contacted Sandy shortly thereafter, and we met another few weeks after that. We've been two peas in a pod ever since.
I was going to say,
as Sandy, they say, the rest is history a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, and something tells me that and Sandy is the type of person that once you get latched on her, she's not going to let you go. So for better or for worse. That's a compliment, Sandy. I'm one of those people too, so don't feel so bad about that. Zach, why don't you talk to?
Sandy's a very driven person.
We know that.
I was gonna ask, kind of go into another question about the actual flood protection, because we always hear, okay, we need to, each storm can kind of lay out those weaker spots. I mean, HJ, what do we have any known weak spots right now within the flood protection walls in the city of New Orleans, whether that be East, West Bank, and whatnot?
I don't think we know a lot about any weak spots we've got in the flood protection system that's here today. Certainly the approach to the twin spans out in Irish Bayou is a little low. After Ida hit, I went out there the next day and took a couple of pictures, and I could see that the debris had washed onto not only the shoulder but the right-hand lane of the interstate going outbound right there at Irish Bayou. So that's still a little low. It's something that I think that the Corps or the Levee District needs to do something about, to keep the wash and the waves out of that lane of traffic. If you really want to get out of town, you're going to use that interstate. And if the interstate's got waves knocking your vehicle around, certainly that won't be a very comfortable approach to getting over the bridge.
Yeah.
What's interesting to note is we at Fox 8, we had to evacuate sort of like that middle of that night. We drove out through Irish Bayou, through I-10, and the water that was still way up all the way. It wasn't on the interstate any longer, but the winds were also dying down at that point. But you could see how much marsh grass was pushed all the way onto the interstate. Like you said, it actually was on the twin spans to some extent.
Well, and I guess the point also to HJ, if we want to talk about the evacuation situation, especially to the east like that, you can have a situation 48 to 72 hours before a storm when we're in our evacuation window where we could just have east winds. Um, Indirectly related to a large storm, or maybe you have a high to the north that's pushing water to very high levels. And so by the time you're starting to get people out, this is where some of this minor flooding could take place. It seems like the fix would be pretty easy there, though. It's not like we're needing 10, 15-foot walls in that area.
I agree, and I don't know why, after all these years of me mentioning it, and Stratford Goins, a former commissioner in the Levee District, doing the same, that nothing has been done. But certainly that's something that hopefully will happen in the next year or so.
All right, let me ask you, HJ, I want to ask you one more question about, and Sandy was mentioning climate change earlier. We have sea level rise, we have subsidence. To me, at least in the near long term, subsidence has almost been a bigger problem in Louisiana than sea level rise. And what is the threat of subsidence as it stands as far as the levees go? That's one of the big problems that we are facing, especially as far as maintenance.
The levees that surround New Orleans and Jefferson Parish and all the different areas around the greater New Orleans area are built on soil, certainly, and subsidence has a way of happening fast at first and then slows down. So the levees and flood walls, although they have subsided some, they're not subsiding like the coast, like the marshes around, let's say, Port Sulphur or any of those almost forgotten areas beyond the flood protection. Those are subsiding because they were created by accretion, by the overflow of the Mississippi River over thousands and thousands of years. And back 150 years ago, the levees so much of that natural overflow of the Mississippi River, and it's frustrating because you've got all these areas that are subsiding, all these areas that were created by overflows of the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River doesn't overflow, and then you've got fights in various parishes and cities and towns along the coast that want to keep the fresh water out just so that the oyster fishermen are happy. So that's a frustrating struggle, and those areas will continue to subside until freshwater and sediment diversion projects are opened wide up and flooding those areas with enough sediment to keep them afloat.
All right, well, let's switch now, Sandy, and talk about what's ahead or what's happening with Levees.org. I know you're advocating for levees across the country, but what about locally? Where do you see there needs to be more work done? And you kind of mentioned this earlier. We'd had Jeff Masters on the podcast, a friend of mine a while back, the founder of Weather Underground, used to run one of the #1 weather blogs, Category 6, in the country. And as early as 2013, he was writing saying, that's great, $16 billion for New Orleans, but he was advocating that we really should have built for a 1 in 1,000 year event flood, not a 1 in 100 year event flood. Because it would have cost around $100 billion, which he said is a drop in the bucket when you look at what New Orleans means to the country, and particularly the Mississippi River. Where else do you think we can go there from now? We don't typically respond to things unless there's a crisis, it seems like, in this country. So how do we change the narrative on that?
I'm glad you brought up Dr. Jeff Masters. He and I have been in communication. We've emailed with each other, for years. And way back, a decade ago, I contacted him because I was trying to find people who predicted that there would be levee breaches, because we were being told, well, you knew the levees would breach. You were told they would breach. And I searched and searched and searched and couldn't find anyone. One person predicted that the levees could breach, and that was Dr. Jeff Masters. So I wrote to him and said, how did you know this could happen? And he said, well, he didn't have secret information that no one else had. He just sort of made this assessment and predicted this could happen. And I said, well, did you alert local official, the governor, the mayor, anybody, and warn us that the levees could breach? She said, I was just a blogger at Weather Underground. No one would listen to me. Here's a gentleman who was right, and he admits he was a bit lucky that something happened that he predicted. So I'm not surprised to hear him doing as well as he is. And in responding to his remark about we should have 1,000-year protection, he's right. An area of an area like New Orleans with all this people, property, and infrastructure, and it's also the port, we should have 1,000-year protection, because of those things I just said. And 1,000-year protection would not mean $100 billion. Now, he's wrong about that. 1,000-year protection would mean only the difference of levee height of 2 or 3 feet along Lake Pontchartrain. We're talking millions, not billions. But we couldn't get that protection because by federal mandate, the Army Corps of Engineers is only allowed to give us 100-year protection. It's the law. They can't. Their hands were literally tied. That's what the Bush administration said after Katrina, and that's what we got. So yes, Jeff Masters is right. I still would like to see this happen, but with the political climate and all the competition for dollars by the federal Corps, I doubt it's going to happen. But at least what I can reassure everybody in the city of New Orleans, we do have 500-year protection because the Army Corps of Engineers kind of did something they weren't supposed to do. They armored the levees so that if they do overtop, they won't break. And they admitted later that they did that.
Now, Sandy, y'all get into a lot of trying to advocate for, getting the levees, getting the flood protection system. What about inside the system? We all know about our antiquated pumping system in Orleans Parish. Are y'all involved in maybe trying to advocate for let's get that, where it needs to be in this day and age?
HJ, you want to take that one?
I've been part of that discussion for the past few years. Thanks to the media reaching out and wondering what the heck is happening when a turbine explodes or when pumps go out or any number of things happen to the system. And the more the media exposes errors by the Sewage and Water Board and errors by their contractors, the more light that shines on the characters there, and the more likely it is that they will try to do a much better job because they know I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. They know the media is out there. They know the media isn't going anywhere. And so, advocating is just really exposing what goes on, what really happened, and why it happened. And yes, we have an old system. Cast iron pipes and cast iron pumps, they're great until they're cracked. The pumps that we've got now, they can do the job. They only run 150, 200 hours a year. It's not like they're busy whizzing away every day, every hour. And provided you maintain them properly, they should last another 20, 30, 40 years. It's just a matter of the guys who maintain them need to make sure that they've got a checklist, that somebody checks the checklist, that as they fire up a newly rebuilt turbine, you don't have some guy who is maybe out on a Friday night trying to do it on a Saturday all alone. Just don't do that. These are multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. Just as you don't fly a plane without a co-pilot, you shouldn't fire up this multi-million-dollar system without somebody checking the checklist with you.
And if I could add one thing on the infrastructure that supports holding water and retaining water instead of just pumping it all out right away. For example, we definitely support that kind of infrastructure at our levee exhibit hall and rain garden at the London Avenue Canal Breach site. We have a huge rain garden that after a rainstorm withholds just so much, not millions of gallons, but definitely thousands of gallons of water, keeping it out of the municipal drainage system, keeping the plants happy. And Levees Org definitely support that kind of infrastructure.
Let me kind of throw a wild card question out here, and something that I talked about a little bit, and a couple of colleagues of mine around the country have as well, the idea that we should have a national disaster fund, and that we basically should pool all of the risk, various risks across the country, and spread it evenly across the nation. Now, there'll be people in North Dakota saying, what are we doing paying for, flood protection along the Gulf Coast? And there's going to be people in, Michigan saying, yeah, well, they live with wildfires in California. But don't you think this would help minimize risk if we spread this evenly across the country and had some kind of national disaster fund, instead of just lurching from disaster to disaster and maybe putting all the onerous on the national flood insurance program, which may not be sustainable, especially when we're talking about changing climates and increasing amounts of rainfall and more intense storms?
I can take that one if that's okay, HJ.
Sure.
Please.
I recently interviewed a guest on my podcast. Her name is Samantha Montano, and she is a disasterologist, and she is definitely behind taking a more of a universal global approach to disasters rather than just responding to each as they happen. So that certainly makes sense to me. But there's another thing that needs to be done. There's a bipartisan bill being pushed by a congressman in Florida and also one of our Louisiana congressmen. I believe it was the doctor Cassidy, and this bill would automatically appoint an independent investigation of every single major disaster that comes along. After Hurricane Katrina and the levee breaches, and after 9/11, there was no independent investigation. Ordinary citizens like myself and HJ and my son had to advocate for an independent investigation, which is crazy. I mean, it should have been automatic. So with laws like Congressman Cassidy's and with a fund like this, it'd be a much better way of responding to disasters than just piecemeal one at a time.
And I can't let you go today, Sandy and HJ, but Sandy, I also want you to be able to promote your podcast. You referred to it, and it's appropriately called Beat the Big Guys. When did you start it, and how's it going?
Sure. I started this in June of this year, and every week I interview a guest who has beat the big guys in his or her or their own neighborhood in some way, and I coach listeners on how to take on problems in their own communities. I basically are telling them the things that I wish someone had told me when I started out, just myself and my son Stanford, who was just 15 years old at the time, and we plugged along for 6 months before HJ joined us, as well as many other people that have been with us over the years. So thank you for asking about my podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I guess to wrap up here today, the message that we want to send to people is that we have a good system, but we don't want to be too complacent because we haven't, quote, yet had that storm that really is going to put them to the test. And nothing is foolproof, right? Everything is subject to something going wrong. But overall, we're a lot better shape than we were 15 years ago.
16,
sorry.
Well, I'm turning into an engineer like HJ.
HJ, do you have any final thoughts on just talking to people out there about after Ida? I really can't stress enough how many people do feel that, because of what happened in the river and bayou parishes, that this was sort of a worst case scenario for New Orleans. And I don't like to beat that down because I don't want to make people, not feel confident about what we have, but we do have to stay vigilant and keep people, aware of what the hurricane threat is relative to each storm.
Yeah, Ida was actually what felt like a more severe wind event than we had when Katrina hit us. I rode both of them out right here in my old house, above sea level. But what the wind does, the wind pushes water around. The wind pushes the water from Lake Bourne up against the levees along the Mr. Go, and pushes water up against the levees along the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. And we've got pretty good protection there now. But every storm has a different personality. Every storm has different timing. Every storm has different wind from a different direction. And the wind changes direction. When Katrina hit us, we had wind from the east and wind from the east and wind from the east, and then eventually wind from the north. That's why the flood surge in the lake wasn't the highest when Katrina's wind was the highest. It was the highest about an hour later when Katrina pushed the water in the lake to the south and then bumped up the water another couple of feet in the canals, which had already failed by that time. So, yes, let's be vigilant. Let's pay attention to what happens to us. If you're in coastal parishes and the Corps of Engineers has a meeting, go to it. If they seem to be saying things that are inconsistent with what you believe, let them know. They react to the public. They may not be the biggest fans of Levees.org, but they have reacted to what we have provided. And just don't be complacent and don't trust your elected officials, because a lot of times they don't necessarily know more than you know about what is affecting you, your property, your family at your location. Well,
very well put. Sandy, HJ, thank you both so much for being on the podcast today. Thank you for your citizenship, what am I trying to say? Your advocacy is what I was trying to say. And yeah, I'm glad you're a citizen too. But at any rate, it's been a pleasure. And again, if you want to read Sandy's book, Words Whispered in Water, Why the Levees Broke in Hurricane Katrina. I hope you both have a great day.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Well, Sandy and HJ certainly have advocated, as I was trying to say, not only just for the city of New Orleans, but Sandy now advocating across the country for adequate levee and flood protection, which is lacking in many communities with many different water problems, ones not just faced from hurricanes. I think really the point we were trying to drive across, and I think we did, and HJ was doing a good point of showing that, was comparing Katrina to, say, Ida, and how really both of these storms missed the New Orleans area from the standpoint of putting our levees to the true test based on the condition they're in today.
And another thing to point out, even though Katrina was weaker than Ida at landfall, Katrina had a Category 5 storm surge. So, that water that was pushed by Katrina is totally different than with the water that was pushed by Ida. But I like the point that Sandy made that, don't take the status quo for just take it. You have to advocate for certain things. Look what they did. I mean, her and her son, and then HJ came along and advocated for Levees.org and getting the right things built, and we can only hope that those right things are built in the flood protection walls, that they're getting tested and they're going to keep passing these tests as we move forward. But the big point, that true Katrina-like surge, which can be said maybe one of the worst case scenarios as far as water is concerned for the city of New Orleans, that hasn't happened yet. Until that happens and those levees hold true, then you really can't sit there and say it. Now, like you said this earlier in the podcast, we don't want people to think, oh, they're not good. The new levees are not good. The new flood protection walls are not great, because they are. But it's the point that we still haven't been tested with that big 10 to 20 foot storm surge right into the heart of that protection system.
And even more importantly, which was so much of the failure during Katrina, were the outfall canals, right? At the foot of Lake Pontchartrain that failed at the 17th Street Canal, the London Avenue Canal. Those are in much, much better shape. And in fact, if we had not had the failures there, and now that we have the floodgates at Lake Pontchartrain, we probably wouldn't have had near the damage that we had.
Yeah, those were those feeders. Those feed right into Orleans Parish, and that just put water right into your front yard if you lived anywhere in Gentilly and along the 17th Street Canal and places like that.
All right, so the lesson today is we've got a great flood protection system here in Southeast Louisiana. It may not have been completely tested yet with Ida as far as the New Orleans area goes. We know it was tested in Lafourche Parish, and also is you want to be an advocate for your neighborhood, for your city, and for your state, and continue to hold everyone accountable, including public officials. For Zach Fidella, I'm David Bernard. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on the podcast.